To say, interacting with students so far has been an especial treat, and I had no idea the methodology by which the prize had been chosen. And to learn about that has been a special honor. To give you a little bit more background on it, it's kind of a fun, let's see if this actually works with both, so I can move around. You hear me okay? Is this not working? Let's see, now it is. Okay, wonderful. So one of the things you should know is I'm actually blessed with a rather extraordinary wife who holds me to rather extraordinary standards. So when President Chacon actually reached out to me, the first sentiment was actually, don't get your hopes up. They may have given it to the wrong person. So now that I've gotten my hopes up, I have to say it's a real delight and treat to be here, especially having learned about how things have been decided. And I'm hoping to have a conversation about how some of these ideas work and how we can actually apply some of these ideas in practical life, in business as well as daily activities. So I actually want to start with a couple of different things. And before we get into the entree, if you will, I'd like to start with a Herb Simon appetizer to see if we could actually connect some of the ideas from 40 years ago, 1971, with Herb Simon himself, to what does this actually imply for platforms today? Then I'd like to actually try to work through a framework that we can apply to several platform problems. And I'm hoping that you can use these in your design decisions for how you conduct business or how you conduct government, or indeed how you defend your own rights as an individual or a citizen in collecting your own data. So that's what I'd like to do over the course of this evening in the short time that we have together. So Herb Simon worked on bounded rationality, how it is that economic agents without perfect knowledge and with limited computational capabilities would make decisions, and how would they introduce this? He won the prize then in '78, and so I want to use that as a motivation for asking a really simple question: how is the more access to information? Could that actually increase information overlap of different agents among a population? Again, an information question. So one would hope that increasing access to information might increase overlap overall. Now, if we take Herb Simon's insights directly, there's a really simple model of this. So we could actually then look at expanding everyone's capacity to reach one another. So let's take the absence of time or the absence of rationality constraints and move from left to right, and we expand the different opportunity. And then measures of group overlap or measures of similarity in group knowledge would actually all converge. So by the end, let's see if this actually works. So similarity in knowledge profiles might be one, and group overlap might be universal. One would hope, and that's the absence of rationality constraints. But if we then take Herb Simon's work originally, and then we actually go introduce that bounded rationality constraint. So you can only, suppose that you have only 2 ears. You can only carry at most 2 conversations at a time. You can have a couple of channels in there. If we introduce that, and then we introduce increasing access, do we get more overlap? Well, here, as you increase the access from local to global, if there are preferences for like-minded contact, in fact, the information overlap might decline in that. It's an interesting observation. So if we look at the measures of group overlap or group similarity, it might actually fall if we go over here from left to right. So it's an interesting challenge on it. So there's an interesting recent developments on this. There are descriptions in recent literature that truth decay occurs when people are so overloaded with information they can no longer separate fact from fiction and fall back on opinion and tribal belief in order to make their decisions. Where are we today? If we looked at some of the other recent literature, it looks at just last year, we're talking about polarization in here, all right? These are how social media might increase polarization of different groups overall. Or if you take a little bit, if this is so trending, in fact, even reader preferences for left or right books are leading to preferences for left or right science, when you would think that science should actually be neutral. What's interesting or fun about this is that we actually built the model of this in 1996 using Herb Simon's ideas. What's fun about this also, this predates Instagram, it predates Facebook. So my youngest son likes to tell his father, This is when dinosaurs roamed the internet. So it's an interesting challenge of how things have changed over that. But using Herb Simon's work, you can actually see how polarization might have happened in the context of increasing information and yet bounded rationality. But there's some good news. The interesting news of this is that it's not driven exclusively by bounded rationality constraints. It's actually driven by preferences. So if preferences are narrow, if preferences are for affinity groups, then yes, we do get polarization. But if they're preferences for diversity, then in fact, we get integration. So it's not required that you get these kind of things. One of the things about being here at Reich is the interdisciplinarity of it all. And what I want to use is as a brief introduction to actually thank you for doing this kind of interdisciplinary work. One of the things I love about business schools is the boundary between theory and application. I want to encourage you to appreciate differences, appreciate diversity, because there are real benefits that happen when this takes place. And this all comes straight out of some of the work of Herb Simon. So it's incredible to have done this, and I really appreciate the thought of the award. So that's the appetizer. Now let's dig into the main course. So what I'd like to cover this evening is 5 questions. How is it that we can actually, to finish that idea, does increasing access to information increase information overlap or not? No, if preferences are narrow, but yes, if preferences are broad. So again, I want to encourage folks to embrace diversity, embrace differences in that, and embrace interdisciplinarity as a way of achieving more interesting results. One of the other wonderful things that you guys awarded the prize to Clay Christensen. One of Clay's most fabulous insights is the value of a framework that you can use to apply across different challenges. So he even makes this wonderful quote that he went into Intel, he talked to the CEO, Andy Grove, and said, if I tried to advise him on semiconductors, I'd have gotten killed. So what he did is he actually taught him a framework on how to think about it. In his context, it was how does disruption happen among firms? So what happened? Well, most firms serve the high-end customers because that's where the margins are. That's where it's actually expensive, you can make the most profits. That means there's a long underserved market. So an entrant comes in with low-quality technology, then this underserved market gets better and better over time. And by the time this technology has advanced, the incumbent isn't familiar with the new technology and can't compete. And that is how the disruption occurs. So it's an interesting idea. And what I'd like to do is to introduce a framework that I hope you can use in the design of your organizations, in the design of governance, in the design of different business models, but also the protection of your own data rights is one single idea that I want to use for several different questions. So here are the questions. The first one is, why do platforms have such high value and so few assets in comparison to other kinds of organizations? The second one is strategy. Why does traditional product strategy fail in the platform marketplace? The third is regulation. In an antitrust context, why does traditional antitrust fail in the platform context? And then lastly, can we use some of this to predict the future of where this is going? For example, can decentralized autonomous organizations dethrone platforms? So many of you may have talked about Web 3.0 or blockchain or other decentralized kinds of organization. Will they dethrone platforms like Amazon or Facebook or Google or others? What I want to argue is that all of these questions have a single answer. I'm trying to convince you of each of these in a case, or sorry, even in the case of fake news, by the way. Why is information such a hard problem? I want to try to convince you that all of these have the same answer. Now, I would describe it as network effects. Now, the traditional model of a network effect is a product or service that gets more valuable as more people use it. But there's a deeper interpretation here that I want to actually try to convey, which is not accidental. If one person joins a network, so one person interacts, the platform takes that information and makes other interactions better. So that might be between a person and a business. Suppose that 2 people interact. The platform then takes that information and makes yet other interactions better. And then another one makes yet other interactions better. These third-party interactions are done by orchestration. It's not done by accident. This portion of it requires governance. What that means is it's not something individuals can do for themselves. The platform has to do it. It's a tiny, tiny bit of value. So Your search might make my search better. Someone's movie watching behavior might make someone else's movie watching behavior. Your Amazon purchase might make someone else's Amazon purchase better. That happens by design. That happens because governance actually makes that move forward. So why is it that platform firms have such high market caps relative to traditional firms? To give you some data on it, if you look at the Forbes 2000 over here, the market value of platform firms on average is 21 billion versus 8 billion. The margins are 21% relative to 12 for traditional firms, and they have half the employees of traditional firms. If you look at the market cap per employee, the ratio is somewhere between 4 times and 25 times or so. And I guess this was even before Elon Musk bought Twitter, right? So he paid not 28, but 44, and now it's got half the employees. So the ratio might be higher. On the other hand, the numerator may now be 0, so maybe it's not anywhere near the same. So the point is simply that the ratio is extraordinary. Why is that happening? What's going on? Again, it's network effects. So what's happening? You can't scale network effects as easily inside the firm as you can outside the firm. What's happening? So if this is the employee base, you can't create the same scale of network effects as you could if you actually tapped all the resources outside the organization, okay? So you get something different. This is what you would get an inverted firm. That is, much of the production of value is now happening outside the organization. If you think about it, the rides on Uber are offered by third parties. The rooms on Airbnb are offered by third parties. The merchants on Amazon are offered by third parties. Even the web pages that Google delivers are not authored by Google, they're authored by third parties. So that's all value created outside the organization. So how are you going to make this happen? So that's the description. What I'd like to do is make sure that we give you design elements of this as well. This is Hal Varian, who's the chief economist for Google. And he argues that your value, maximum protection is not equal to maximum value. If you try openness, well, then you get Linux over here on one axis. If you get a closed system, then you capture all the value, but third parties are not adding to it. Matter of fact, TiVo is a set-top box. They used intellectual property law to sue people that were trying to add value to their products. I can show you the more you sue people, yes, the more value they will tend to add to your products on that. So you have to be careful about that. And what you want is a level of openness that tries to capture both. To put it simply, 5% of a €1 billion market is more valuable than 95% of $1 million market. So that's what you want to try to capture. So how would you actually go about doing that? We actually looked at a lot of firms that were actually opening up. How would you measure the openness? So one of the ways we looked at, this is a map of APIs, application programming interfaces that companies have opened. So each dot represents a technology for opening. Each link represents a connection across those. And this is all of 25,000 APIs across the programmable web, the entire library of different companies that use these. If you look at how these have evolved over the last 15 years, that's 7 years later, that's all the way to 2017, you can look at the linkages. I know many of you studied social network analysis, but the index of betweenness often predicts your social power. Here, the index of betweenness in a company will predict your economic power through the APIs. What's interesting is if you get third parties to build on your resources, you get more value out of that process. So this is a plot of the net income in the quarters leading up to companies opening their APIs versus after. So that's the red group. They open and their net income changes to that red line after that. This is the black group. They open, let third parties add value, and their net income changes after that. This is the green group after that. What's interesting is that for a $250,000 investment, the market value of these firms changed by $80 million for a $2 billion firm. It's unbelievable what they've done. It's conditional on getting others to add value. So if you didn't get developers to invest, that didn't happen. But it's also openness, it's external value. So if we look at this plot represents 20 quarters before opening APIs and 20 quarters after. The top row represents those companies that use the technology to invite third parties in. Underneath that is those statistically insignificant to those that use the technology for internal productivity. This is trying to manage your supply chain. It's your employees, your own internal resources. It wasn't bringing third parties into the ecosystem. The bottom is what happened to the market cap of those companies that didn't invest in the technology at all. 20 quarters out, there was an $8 billion difference in the average firm. And I'm not talking about Amazon and Google. It didn't matter if you were in retail or in steel production or in others. Those companies that managed to get third parties to co-invest actually grew significantly in market value. So what about product strategy? Why is product strategy so different in a platform market? So if network effects are driving value, what I want to argue is that the community becomes a key asset. So I'll ask you a question here. Between these two things, if you have a calculator, how easy is it to add the community to that calculator? Versus if we have the community, how easy is it to add the technology on top of that? I don't have it here, but on my Android phone is a $1 Hewlett-Packard financial calculator. Hewlett-Packard didn't do it. Android didn't do it. A third party did it. And yet it's wiping out the sales of Hewlett-Packard. The argument that I want to make is it's easier to add a technology to a community than it is to add a community to a technology. But differently, how easily could Hewlett-Packard add a community to its calculator? That's really hard to do. But if you ask how easily did Google displace Hewlett-Packard, it was trivial. They did it without even trying. Someone else did it for them. So again, it's this community is more valuable than the technology itself. Well, that's a different way of looking at the problem of it. So what do we teach in business schools? It's usually Porter's 5 forces. Why? What you want in the traditional model is to create barriers to entry. You don't want entrants to come in to compete your profits away. You don't want substitute products in there. You want to minimize the buyer power so they don't actually extract rents, or the supplier power so they don't extract rents. You focus on cost leadership so you can justify and support low prices, or product differentiation so you can justify high prices. And you try to control the assets so your competitors don't produce what you produce on that. So what happens in that context? Well, here, that's not how platforms work. They focus on the interactions, that's that external community. So you want to get as many interactions, production and consumption, happening as possible. Think of it as, so you're going to get those interactions. Those create the network effects, the demand economies of scale that will protect your profit margins every bit as much as your supply side economies of scale. You also want not barriers to entry, but permissionless entry of production and consumption. Amazon wants as many merchants on its ecosystem as possible. Google and Apple want as many developers on their ecosystems as possible. Uber wants all the drivers. Airbnb wants all the hosts. Alibaba wants as many of those many merchants on their system as possible. So you want frictionless entry of production and consumption, not barriers to entry for competition, and how that works. The other thing is you don't need to own all the assets. So if this is the long tail diagram of the different assets on the firm, so if you were to look at all of the different apps that came on your phone or the different apps that came in the ecosystem in here, you might own those at the head of the distribution. For Word, PowerPoint, and Excel on Windows, you might own those, but you open up everything else. What I encourage you to do is add up in your head all of the value from here out there. The third party value dwarfs the value that the core firm is creating on its own. You need that third party value in order to create value on top. That's one of the key differences in design of these systems as opposed to design of alternate systems, okay? And there's another interesting element of this. What happens when others innovate on your behalf? Something may start out on the long tail, and then it gets popular and moves up, and it gets popular and moves up. Once you recognize this, that serving the unserved market with a low-end technology, you can pull it into your own platform, and this stable core, which is the platform, simply absorbs the flexible things on top. You can help to avoid disruption. It's a very different business model. So you use the ecosystem as a sensing function for undeveloped opportunities and pull those opportunities into the platform to create added value for you. It's another way of looking at it. So to simply summarize on the strategic side, what happens in product markets is to have market forces of buyers, suppliers, and rivals. You focus on the supply side economies of scale. You look at you control those inimitable assets, and you look at you keep the entrance out. You create barriers to entry in your marketplace. That's not what platforms do. They have overlapping producers and consumers. You even invite competitors into your ecosystem. You focus on the network effects to create those values. And over here, you do innovation by the firm as well as the ecosystem, and you have permissionless entry as opposed to barriers to entry. You want that production and consumption on top of the platform. So why does traditional antitrust fail in a platform market? This is a very big question in Europe, in China, and in the United States, pretty much across the globe. So if we look, and I like this particular one, so this is an Amazon referee calling foul on an Amazon player, or it could be a soccer game instead of baseball. But this issue has come up in the Digital Markets Act here in Europe, in the Digital Services Act, in the Chicago Stigler report, in the UK government report, the Australian government report, on China. This is a global issue in terms of being able to dominate different markets. Well, what are our tests for market dominance or market problems? The first of them is market dominance in here. So is market share high or abused? Now my question then is Amazon in books or cloud or groceries? Is Alibaba in e-commerce or health or banking or movies? What are the boundaries of those industries? Or what about restricted output? The reason that antitrust often intervenes is that firms are restricting their output in order they can exploit you. They can charge higher prices. But is Google restricting your search? Amazon restricting your purchases? Facebook restricting your posts? It's the opposite. They want you to post as much as possible. So that test of antitrust isn't working. Or we just heard a moment ago about two-sided pricing. Usually the test for predation is either pricing above marginal cost, which is an index of your market power, or below marginal cost because you're going to drive the competition out and then extract extra revenues after you've killed the competition. So either of those seem to be the test, and yet platform markets price at zero. So that fails as a test of predation. If you have a concept of a firm as an inverted firm, we have better explanations for these phenomena. So it makes much more sense. You have a hard time defining the boundaries if you let anyone in. So defining the boundaries is hard if third parties are producing the apps or offering the books or offering the merchant sales. If we take a look at restricted output, if your firm has zero marginal costs of production, why? Because third parties are doing the cost of production. You have no reason to restrict output because every single additional sale is in your pocket. You get a royalty on each instance. So zero marginal cost production by others, you want as many of those happening as possible. Or then, of course, the two-sided pricing justifies subsidy to one side in order to capture the other side. So how would we think about that? So I think the way to address it is to think about the question differently. If you read the Digital Markets Act, what are they seeking to do? They're seeking, and this is a literal quote from the documents, how do we create competition, fair contestable markets, and restore user business control over the data that affects them? I submit to you that's not the right question. Once you understand how value is created, what you should be asking is the question, how do we create wealth and divide it fairly? Let's see why that matters. So what does the value look like on a platform? So I'm just see if there are any folks in here. So on a platform, value rises with network effects. Anyone want to motion with a hand? What does Metcalfe's law look like? I think this audience probably knows. Right? Anyone know? What does Metcalfe's law look like as you add users to your ecosystem? No, Excellent. Okay, exactly, correct. Yes, thank you. Right, showing an exponential curve. Yes, it looks like that, right? It's pretty straightforward. It's an n squared. Now, what happens if we split Facebook into Instagram, Facebook, and WhatsApp? You don't have one firm, you have three. So now take a look at that, and you take n over 3, and you square that, and you've got n squared over 9, plus you've got 3 terms back, so you've got a third of the value. That's not what you want. So if you're dividing the asset, you're destroying the value. It's not like, information is not like a tangible good. Data is not like a tangible good. So we have to do something different. What happens if you invite third parties in? Then rather than carving that asset, third parties can also add to the network effects, and you get that as a result. You get n plus m, so you get this extra boost. So if things are rising with the community as the value, then we have a different value creating process. So how would we do that? Okay, so go back to our question of Amazon as a good example. What does the legislation propose? Well, it seems unfair for Amazon to umpire its own game and then use ecosystem partner data to go enter their markets. And so the proposal is to forbid them from doing that. Is that wise? That keeps them from creating value. In the United States or in China, actually, in any other market, you welcome competition because it gives you innovation, it gives you better prices in there. So you want others to enter, but it's the unfairness that's the problem. So perhaps the solution is not to do this barring them of entry. Instead, what we do is we give access to everyone, but at the same time with a delay. What does that do? Just like a patent system, those that innovate get to use the data for a while, but then you get market entry not just by the platform, but by anyone capable of offering a better product or service. So we're using the property of this non-rival asset of information and letting multiple people create value. So that's at the firm level. Now let's see what about user rights level, see if we can actually help you get more value from your data. So what's the current legislation? The current legislation is effectively data portability, which gives you the right to take that data out of the ecosystem and put it wherever you like. The idea is that then firms will have to negotiate with you in order to gain access to your data. But I assert that has several problems. The first of these problems is you lose context. If you try to take your data out of Facebook and someone else has posted relative to yours, you don't get that post because that's their data. Or if you take something from a store, they lose that context because that's their data in there. Another problem is it becomes impotent. You can't make a purchase once it's off the platform. You can't share a post or receive a benefit once it's on someone else's platform. A third problem is once you've yanked it out, it becomes stale. It's not the most recent data. You need the most recent data for it to be the most valuable. And there are a couple of other interesting challenges here. It is assumed that if stores could take their ratings data off of Amazon, then they wouldn't be so held up by Amazon in charging higher rents. So what they do is they want stores to be able to take their data and their ratings, but now what happens? Stores drop their 1- and 2-star ratings and make it look like they have all 4- and 5-star ratings. So you could get cheated on the basis of misinformation, or rather selective presentation of information. And finally, there was a wonderful study that was done at NYU where they were trying to help monitor your data on Facebook to see if you're being shown misinformation. They got permission from users to install an app and actually do tracking, whether or not you're being shown misinformation. Facebook finds out about that, they shut off the APIs. Said, no, you can't see that anymore. This is after Mark Zuckerberg has said, you decide. But now what they're doing is they're preventing you from even getting benchmarking of your own conditions. They're preventing that. Is there a better way to do that? Let's take a look at the way the presentation of the data in here. If you look at the production and consumption side, the small circle might be the data that you own, which is just the data that you create. That's distinct from the data that you could see. So What are the things that your friends are posting about you? How do they respond to your data? If you're a company, what's the data that you see about competitors? That's the stuff that you can see, which is not the stuff that you own. You can make better decisions if you have all of that. So what we propose is an in situ data right. This is the ability to take an algorithm and bring it to your data where it is resident. What does that do? So if you can actually take an algorithm and bring it into your own context, the first is it preserves all of the context. You can see everything else that the individual could see, so you can make better decisions. It's also recent. You don't worry about it getting stale. It also is high potency. You can use it to make presentations. You could use it to actually make a purchase or receive a benefit. You don't get selective presentation. And now you can monitor Facebook. You can see what they're showing. If you have the right to import an algorithm and assess what they're doing, then you can actually benchmark that same data against yourself. And there's one last benefit. Imagine that you could invite Google to show you ads on your Facebook account. What does that mean? Google will then share their advertising revenue with you in order to gain your permission. This in situ data right makes you the bottleneck, not the platform. Well, Facebook then says, geez, I don't want Google taking over that role, so Facebook's going to share that. Then Google will compete again, and it means that they'll compete back to share that value with you, the user, to give you value back from your data. So this in situ data right would help solve many of those same economic problems. Notice what it does. It allows multiple parties to create value from that. And since you're the bottleneck, they're going to have to get your permission and then share that value with you. So it's another way of perhaps actually solving some of these economic problems in the ecosystem. Another question is fake news. This is one of the biggest challenges of our time. To me, I think this is, we're seeing this in the United States in spades in what's happening. So how do we deal with that? And it's interesting, this isn't a new problem. If you look at Google Ngrams, as far back as they go, there are problems with misinformation or fake news or disinformation going all the way back into the 1800s. There's a spike in World War II, and there's a spike in disinformation in the Cold War. Notice there's a huge spike up in fake news in recent times. So, but it's an old problem, but it's suddenly become an extraordinarily pressing problem in comparison to where it used to be, just looking at some of the history of it. Notice, interestingly, if you said bad things around the king, that was sedition. If you said bad things about God, well, that was blasphemy. And if you said bad things about your neighbors or other citizens, well, that was slander. So we've had different versions of this for a long time, but didn't have actual solutions for it in the traditional way. So I'm going to argue that it's not the fakeness that's the critical element of this. To give you an example, there are many false statements that don't matter. So is Pluto a planet or an asteroid? A planet or an asteroid? It's not going to change your life. There's another wonderful restaurant called Jay's. It was in Boston. The slogan there is, eat at Jay's and live forever. That's provably false. We know that that's not going to happen, right? Matter of fact, they died after COVID, so they must not have been eating their own food. So something happened to that. Or finally, Rita Haywork is back from the dead. None of that's actually happening. At the other end of the spectrum, much true news does matter. And by the way, fake news that's disbelieved doesn't matter. True news that's disbelieved may actually matter in a serious way. Truth being used for voter suppression matters. One of the most interesting examples is what's happening in much of the anti-vax movement. Will they take two truths to concoct a lie? They'll say a famous person did die a week after receiving the COVID vaccine, and yet those two things are totally unrelated to another, right? They died of blood cancer or some other phenomenon. So they take two things and put them together to make it appear as though there was a connection. I would argue that what's really happening, the danger is the externalities. It's the damage that's occurring off platform. So one other point about this is truth is a bad element for mechanism design or bad element for law. You can't own truth. You can't be dispossessed of truth. So that makes it very, very hard to use that as a point for law. So how would we solve that problem? I would argue that the mechanism is actually one of, again, externalities. So negative externalities cause damage off platform. It might be the loss of herd immunity from the absence of vaccination. It might be the shooting in a pizza parlor that happens because of misbeliefs, or it might be insurrections that happen as a result of misbeliefs, of fake information in there. The interesting thing about this is it puts a different twist on the problem. An externality in economics is a market failure. A market failure requires intervention. Intervention by government in the United States is forbidden by the First Amendment, and in a lot of countries, you don't want government controlling speech. So in normal cases, when you might want government intervention to solve market failure, you have a real problem, because we've got a mechanism where the government, if they did it, would then control speech, which then leads us to the different question of how you would design solutions to this problem. The interesting thing is, if you understand this as an externality problem, you also now understand why there's too much pollution, if you will. So because people are not internalizing the externalities, the damage that's happening, they're producing too much pollution, so we're getting too much misinformation. That plot that I showed you a moment ago of skyrocketing misinformation, if everybody is suddenly a source of information and people don't internalize the damage, then of course you're going to get more pollution as an explanation. The other thing is attempts by courts to turn things over to the free market of ideas don't work, because markets don't self-correct market failures. It doesn't happen. You need governance mechanisms to do that. The implication for that is then we need mechanisms to internalize and decentralize the governance. So no one person, not Elon Musk, no one government, no one firm, not Facebook, decides. We need decentralized mechanisms to do that. A few possible proposals for that kind of solution are, imagine these are different agents here, right? And you've got green reporting truth and yellow reporting falsehood. Most legislation focuses on transparency. What's transparency? It simply says who said what. It says how much someone paid for an ad or paid a recording on what they said. Transparency alone doesn't solve the problem. If you watch, this Green Party could learn that something had been said around them, and they could then correct the news in their own network. But that's just the folks that they have access to. What you need is to enable counter speech with access, so that you could find out who had also received the misinformation and reach them. You can even do so in a way as privacy preserving. You don't need to know who received it. You just need to be able to get them a message. So you need to enable counter speech to solve that decentralized externality problem. So if this agent is affected, they could propagate the news again to have it corrected in a decentralized fashion. Another one, of course, is really simple, would be to simply use peer juries in this. If different parties are affected, peer juries have legitimacy for most of the other kinds of things that we try to address. And so if peers sample, it's very hard to discredit that jury because they're like us. So instead of just discrediting the rater, we might be able to use peer juries to that. Then there's one last one, which is, how would you know that a claim is true? What's a signal of that? I'll give you an interesting, fun example of that. So that's peer juries in that. But I was trying to buy a bike lock for my son, and I was looking at different claims on Amazon. So I'll ask you, here are 3 different representations. Let's see, the claim is, I'm going to protect your bike from theft. Now, which of these 3 claims is the credible one? The first has no warranty. The second one has a 90-day money-back guarantee and a 3-year warranty on the locking mechanism. And the third has a lifetime warranty with insurance on your bike if it's stolen. Which claim is the most credible? It's the one who's willing to guarantee their claim because they know that it's true. What's interesting about this, suppose that we were to enable folks the ability to actually warrant their claims, and it could be any kind of capital. So again, blue is true and yellow is false in here. Now, what happens if we allow folks simply to warrant? It could be with monetary capital, it could simply be with social capital. Suppose I make a claim that's true, and I'd be willing to sacrifice 10% of my social network if my claim is false. Then what happens? Okay, then if that party makes a false claim, they would sacrifice that network. Now notice what this does. The first thing is, who knows whether the claim is a lie or not better than the author? This puts the burden on the party that's making the claim. in the first place. The second thing is liars don't want to forfeit their influence. So geez, now they say, I don't want to warrant. But notice, if the claim is honest, it costs you nothing. So the honest claimants can actually make claims that are credible, whereas the dishonest ones don't want to make it, so they don't want to warrant. Then you're, as a consumer, you know instantly, is it true or false? Because are they willing to warrant or not? And it's voluntary. It doesn't require any of that at all. So it's a signaling and screening mechanism combined with externality economics to try to go after that problem as a way to go after, and it's totally decentralized. It doesn't involve government, doesn't involve an individual. It involves the party making the claim. And notice, it's now cheaper to make a true claim than a false claim because it doesn't cost you anything. It's a different mechanism. It's a decentralized mechanism. The last question is, are decentralized organizations going to dethrone platforms in there? And then the question really is a very simple one, which is, if it's the case that blockchain technology or Web 3.0 reduces friction, so if you take out a middleman or a gatekeeper in there, if that's all they did, then yes, decentralized organizations could potentially dethrone platforms because you're taking the gatekeeper out and you're reducing friction. But what did I show you in the very beginning? It's not just reduction of friction, it's taking that value and transporting it to other places. That is adding all of these other valuable interactions. That's not taking away friction, that's adding network value. So the claim is blockchain technology and DOAs do not provide orchestration and governance. So if the only thing they do is reduce friction, no, they will not displace platforms. Uber, Facebook, Amazon, to the extent that they're doing orchestration and governance of externalities, they are completely safe. On the other hand, if your smart contracts start to internalize those externalities, those positive network effects, and propagate those across different parties, then in fact, decentralized organizations might have some way of tackling and dethroning platforms. So those are all different mechanisms. So if, in effect, they're resolving positive market failures, that's the creation of additional value as opposed to negative market failures in the case of fake news, you're internalizing those externalities. So that's a different way of looking at it. So again, I'll try to convince you, here is a framework that you can use to go after all of these different problems once you understand network effects and positive externalities. So what was the case in structure? Positive network effects drive inverted firms where value is being created outside the organization. So what's happening is assets are not counted on the balance sheet. So it looks like these firms are much smaller. They have fewer assets, fewer employees. So network effects explain that firm structural difference. What do you do about it? You open to build community and you do the orchestration. That's the design element of trying to take these tools to another level. What about traditional product strategy in platform markets? Well, if community is your asset, you want permissionless entry, not barriers to entry. So you're flipping the logic. What do you do as a design element? How do you use it? Well, surprise, surprise, you open to build community and you orchestrate network effects. So you use that tool to build those positive surpluses. Why does traditional antitrust fail in platform markets? Traditional antitrust deals with rival assets where your use of it actually means someone else can't use it. That's not true in information. Here, network effects increase in scale, not in breakup and splitting the asset. Data is different than steel or sugar or cars. Instead, what you want to do is share the non-rival asset, use something like in situ rights so multiple parties can create it, and let multiple firms create value on top of that. It's a different way of organizing antitrust in order to use the new economics of information goods as distinct from traditional economics of physical goods. What about information and news? That is a negative network effect. All these others are positive. That one is negative. Firms are not orchestrating those. The damage is occurring off platform. They're not dealing with it. What that means is we need, and the interventions are typically barred in having governments or do that kind of orchestration. So in that case, what we need to do is create decentralized organizations. For reference, I think what we need to do is to combine the ideas of Ronald Coase in decentralized externalities, the same way we create carbon trading markets, and also combine those with signaling and screening economics from Spence, Stiglitz, and Akerlof. Those combinations of ideas, I think, are going to be the solutions to that problem going longer term. And then lastly, can decentralized autonomous organizations dethrone platforms? Those require governance. If Web 3.0 and blockchain don't provide governance, then they cannot dethrone platforms. But if they start to do the design and do smart contracts, then yes, they potentially could, but it's only on condition that they actually orchestrated those network effects. So what I've tried to do is to give you a framework to be able to answer this or any other question on understanding these phenomena. If you understand these externalities, it can actually help explain where we are, but then also use this as a design science to predict and control the different outcomes and actually build new systems, whether you're building companies, whether you're building legislation, tools, or technologies. These are the kinds of things that you need to try to do in order to make these things work. So with that, I simply want to say thank you. Again, it's really an honor to be here, and I'm touched that it was the student choice. I hope this is something that you can take and actually create value in your own lives in data science or in data rights or others, and take these into design tools for the rest of the things you're doing. So with that, again, thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your outstanding lecture. Hereby, I encourage everyone to put questions for Professor van Alstyne, and we would like to allow as many questions as possible, so phrase it briefly, please.
And I'm very happy to get questions. And if I don't have any, I'm happy to ask them, so be careful.
Well, okay, you can hear me. So thank you for the lecture, and I was really inspired by what you said. But I did have a question for you regarding fake news. As you mentioned, we should decentralize these institutions to internalize negative network effects. However, in these platforms, you also know that they create echo chambers, which makes it harder to internalize a negative network effect if it doesn't even if the chosen community doesn't regulate what you say. So you make a warrant, but no one who yeah, I think that you can understand. And I wanted to ask if there should be more governance in this decentralized, or how do you see that these things could change, which also reflects to this question?
So I take that as two separate questions. I like both of them. So the first one is, how do you deal with echo chambers in this different suite of solutions? And the second is more on the design of the governance itself. So the first, that was only 3 solutions. Actually, this is such a complex problem that I think it needs a whole suite of solutions. So I actually think the way to deal with the echo chamber question is what I would call reverse amplification. That is, holding liars accountable for lies in a way that, instead of amplifying them and giving them breathing space. So unfortunately, the machine learning algorithms amplify them because this is what gets engagement, which gives the advertisements, which in a sense, it's letting someone create a spark, and the platform then pours on gasoline and burns down the neighborhood so they can sell ads while people watch the fire. That's not what we want. What we really want is a platform that reverse amplifies liars rather than amplifies them. If we did an involuntary reduction in them, suppose that I were to reduce your network or delay your messages after you had been proven to have been lying on science or vaccinations or flat earth or what have you, then it would put the burden back on the ideologue to tell truth as a way to do that, even if they didn't warrant. The problem is that's not business model compatible. So we need to actually put additional pressure on the platform in order to internalize that externality that they are not doing. Candidly, we need at least 3 tiers of solution. One is the individual label, so that's the warrant. The second is the platform layer, so we get them to behave. And the third is probably the design of legal infrastructures to deal with platform liabilities or reform to law. So I think we need actually all three of those. If you're interested in that, we actually have some work on that question specifically. The next question is then governance. I think the proper way to do that is to decentralize governance in ways that should also be recognizable. So to the extent that platforms individually are not behaving well, we could try to create governance structures that separated by analogy legislation from executive from judiciary. So suppose one group gets to define fake news, then left and right even might be able to agree on definitions if they can't agree on a specific instance. A judiciary then gets required to use those definitions. They don't get to use their own definitions. Just like a judge, they don't get to make the laws, they have to apply the laws. Then the platforms, they don't get to decide and they don't get to define, they only get to enforce what the judiciary decides. That decentralizes it, again, try to split the agency problem of self-interest from the decisions that they would make. So I would try to use that decentralized governance structure as a means to deal with your second question. It's a great set of questions.
Thank you.
Thank you for your outstanding lecture. It was really amazing to listen to you. So my question would be about platform business relevance for Europe. And how can platform businesses overcome the language barriers and cultural barriers in Europe? So it's I would argue that it's much harder to launch platform businesses here in Europe because the market is fragmented, not like in the US. So I'm not sure if you have any idea on that, but I would love to hear it.
I give you credit for a really powerful insight. The more fragmented the market, the harder it is to create broad scale network effects. Matter of fact, one of the observations we made is it's probably easier to create platform business models in homophone markets, English speaking and Mandarin speaking. That's partly why they're so big. That's a great insight, so I give you credit for that. It's really very good. So I think there are two ways that if you're a European that you might try to address that. One, almost every single platform starts niche before it goes broad. So start in a niche area where you can add real value by doing something that's unique to a culture, unique to a citizen, unique to a technology. There are a couple of very good things that were launched here. Skype, an interesting example, something that started here. So that's one. The second is to leapfrog past that and go to another generation. Here's one where I think things were going to happen. I think as we move to the Internet of Things, we're going to be an explosion of interactions. At the moment, the dominant platforms are B2C, Amazon, Google, Facebook. B2B tends to be fewer number of interactions because it's firm to firm has a smaller number of interactions. That's going to change when you go from machine to machine because there are going to be more machines than people. So the number of interactions in the IoT space, Internet of Things space, should explode. So what you should do is to leapfrog and go to those areas where new interactions are going to take that aren't language dependent. And you can actually be able to build some interesting platforms in that domain. We might actually be able to take the lead. You have some industrial firms here. A good example, Siemens Corporation is a very good one. It's actually working in the space, and they're doing a better job than GE in the United States. So I think those are two ways to actually try to advance that agenda.
The in-situ data rights topic, you talked about algorithms, and I was just wondering who owns those algorithms.
So the beauty is you could design that algorithm. You could pay someone else to write that algorithm. You could have a consumer reports algorithm. It basically is your virtual avatar, and you get to choose. So the point is to try to create a marketplace on top of divergent algorithms. But you are the bottleneck. And so it's your specific choice as to which algorithm you import, whether it's one you yourself built or one that was third-party approved or one that you contracted for. So if you can create a marketplace of competing algorithms, Facebook can't control it alone, and you can get different value created based on how you want it presented. how you want it received. That's a marketplace on top. Again, the hope is by allowing multiple parties to create their own versions and compete with that, you're going to get multiple parties adding value as opposed to dividing the asset. That's the goal. So create a marketplace on top. Anybody could do it as long as you're the decision point. And notice, by the way, you can turn it off. If you don't like what someone's doing, you turn it off, revoke their access, and it's better because you don't have to worry if they destroyed the data. They never had it. So you can revoke their access to your data and be comfortable that they never took it. So hopefully that'll actually solve, again, create some of the benefit. And other questions?
Thank you. Sorry, very interesting talk. Something that was very surprising to me or interesting that you were treating these networks as very much symmetric between different users, the different sides of the platform, and something that I would like to ask your opinion on is gig workers. So is there a different political or normative issue regarding how the surplus is shared by the platform and people like Uber drivers or I don't know, people delivering food, vis-a-vis how the surplus is split between consumers and the platform? So to what degree is it symmetric, and what's the regulatory aspect of it?
So let's make clear, I don't assume that they're symmetric. Even if we go back to the mathematical models we have, the externality running from the producer to consumer market, we introduce a term so that it's a different size and scale than the other direction. So we allow the network effects to be different in size and scale, and they could even be heterogeneous within a given community. So we do acknowledge that there are differences in there, and they're also in launch strategy. You tend to reward marquee, the high value users, more than others. I'll give you a different metaphor, and I think we're in fairly early stages. My impression is that we're in a shift in the economy now, in the shift toward demand side economies of scale, network effect companies, exactly analogous to the shift in the economy we saw 150 years ago in the industrial era as we got supply side economies of scale. We had horrible pollution problems. We had terrible exploitation of labor at that point in time. And it took a while for legislation to catch up with, in the industrial era, the rights to the workers. In the same way, we're going to see the same sets of issues here. It's going to take a while to readapt the legislation to provide the rights to the workers and those providing the data. So I think we need to borrow insights from what happened a century ago and re-import those into what's happening now to rework the legislation so that, notice, the center of all this is the party doing orchestration network effects, and it gives them monopoly power. It gives them excessive power. So what we want to do is to find ways of breaking up the power without breaking up the value. And so we need new legislation that achieves that. And that, hopefully, by reducing that market power, by creating marketplaces with these in situ data rights, it makes the individual the bottleneck, not the platform, which should help to reduce that market powers. I think that's the approach to solving that problem.
So during your lecture, you have talked a lot about data governance, and then you have also mentioned Twitter. Now with the recent changes happening, before the company was giving the blue tick, meaning that you were a verified account, and Twitter decided who's that and who isn't. But now everyone can buy that tick for like $8. How do you think this is going to affect the fake news and the networks, and this is who can you trust, and etc.?
Along the way to reinventing the tire, Elon Musk is reinventing the flat tire. He's actually causing some trouble and reintroducing problems in some cases have been solved. The moderation questions are really deep and hard, and he's just trying to relearn a lot of those things that the companies had themselves. Twitter had a really good moderation department. They started as the free speech wing of the free speech party, and they learned how to do it, and now he's just starting out all over again. It's fascinating you should say that. There are already news stories of, I forget, there was a company, somebody bought, it was a pharmaceutical company, and they bought the blue chip for either Eli Lilly or Johnson & Johnson, and then said, okay, now insulin's going to be free, and their stock price plummeted. Or folks are now claiming that they are doctors, and they're actually anti-vaxxers. The first of these is you have to do the due diligence so the blue check actually says what it's supposed to say. And he hasn't done that. He just charged the $8 and then let them say that. So first is you have to have a true signal, if you will. So he hasn't actually managed to achieve that component of it. Separately, it's not quite the question that you asked. It's one of the reasons why I like the warranty mission, because it doesn't then hinge on who said it. It's mattering what's being said and whether they believe it's true or not. You're not going to be willing to warrant something that you know is false. So I think that's another solution to that problem. But I think the unfortunate thing is Elon Musk really understands technology. He's great at rockets and electricity and storage and drilling. Those are technology problems. And he's trying to apply that to political problems. And he's making a lot of mistakes that he doesn't need to be making at the moment. So I think he's coming back up the learning curve, and it'll be really interesting to see how fast he gets there. If he gets there too slowly, Twitter isn't going to be in trouble. If he gets there quickly, there are some things that he can do that can actually make a big difference. I do think there are some solvable problems, but he's not approaching them in the right way.
Thank you, Professor. You mentioned that false news should be considered as pollution, and I would actually have a question regarding the mechanism that you should use to label the news as fake or truth, and more specifically about the time frame, because if I say something, it might mean a different thing, like 2 days or 2 years later. And how would you approach this problem? And it could also mean that right now I label it as false, but a year later it turns out that it was truth. So
that's a really hard question. And this is one where I actually have to credit, Germanic countries. I will probably be saying this incorrectly, but I'm not sure if you've heard of the Entscheidungsproblem. This was Hilbert's problem. And the question was, if you have any set of propositions, can you establish that that set of propositions is true or false? And it took 13 years before Alonzo Church and Turing proved formally you cannot. So it's not possible to know absolute truth. The implication for your question is that you can only know truth to a given number of bits, that is, roughly to a given level of certainty. Interestingly enough, as a practical application, that's what we do with juries. It's usually to a reasonable doubt, which effectively allows for a certain level of certainty. So the practical solution to that problem is to have a time window or time boundedness to it on the extent to which a particular claim is made true or not. To give you an obvious example, thousands of years when humans thought the Earth was flat, or another set of thousands of years when they thought it was a heliocentric, geocentric universe as opposed to a heliocentric universe. You can only know truth to a given number of bits. So the way to handle it is choose a time window and a level of certainty. And you can know to a given level of certainty within a given time. And then when new information accumulates at some time later, it's okay that that's invalidated because that's still consistent with the framework. So pick a level of certainty and pick a time window, and that's a way to try to approach that problem. Right, that's probably more theory than you get in most business school classes.
I would actually have another question. If no one else wants it, but I was just thinking that if false news or fake news only have a negative effect if it impacts your life on a mass scale, and I think that mostly the topic that affects people are political issues or questions. And do you think like a future where we just say that we ban out these topics, like political topics from these platforms? So we select the topics that we think could have a negative effect on people. and we just say that, okay, we will not allow it on the platforms until it is like scientifically backed and it can be proved that it is true or false.
Wow, you're going farther on the intervention than I would go. That's an interesting issue. So I give you two different responses to that. So one of those, well, I think it would be similar in some sense to what Apple does in trying to create some safe environments where it disallows pornography, it disallows hate speech and other things that in some cases might be allowed under other domains. And what you're creating in that context is a more welcoming environment, which then allows some freedom and some greater trust and things of that sort. At the same time, you need to allow some political dissensus. I think it lets off a political safety valve. If you suppress speech too much, then dissent goes underground and it can boil over. So I think there need to be safety valve. There need to be places where you can discuss things that are unpleasant or controversial or which are not yet known, and you use it as a way to equilibrate and balance to what is known. So I'd be careful about going too far and disallowing it. I would be perfectly comfortable about saying, okay, here's a place where you can choose to discuss those issues, and here's another place where you can choose to go ahead and also choose not to discuss them and choose to discuss them, and then let folks decide that. But I would be personally against making that infeasible to do. I'd still want some forum where it's possible to discuss even the harshest, nastiest, most controversial stuff in order that you can try to create a safety valve and create some counter speech in cases. I think there's some really, really good discussions of some of those issues and some of the original writing of John Stuart Mill and how it is that listening to falsity can even sharpen your own understanding of what's really true, as opposed to just taking it as an assumption. And that actually is a deeper level of understanding than just taking it for granted and being part of your background culture. And so it's up to you as to what level of challenge you're willing to accept. But I think that's one of the responsibilities of its society, and tolerating untruths and figuring out how to understand what's true and what's false. So if there are no more questions, I don't know if we should get some coffee or any other questions at all. Well, with that, if not, then I'm very happy to take things personally. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Now that our event is coming to its end, I would like to remind everyone that photo and video recordings have been made of the event and the lecture. So make sure to follow our Facebook page and if you would like to stay updated. Thank you all for attending this evening and have a nice evening.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
It's been an honor, and I invite you to connect. Thank you.